Recording in.
Brilliant. So the session this afternoon is going to be led by myself and Richard Hopkins, who is here as well from our education team. And we are going to be delivering for you an update that has been provided by the national team. So this isn't a presentation that we've prepared ourselves, but it's the information that we've been provided to share with you. So we'll be working through that this afternoon. There are quite a lot of slides, so we'll be moving through at quite a fast pace. We're aware that you probably will have questions, and we're going to ask you to drop those into the chat. If we take questions and discussion this afternoon, we will be here for a lot longer than the hour. So if you could drop any questions into chat, we will look at those after our session this afternoon, and then we will find a way to feedback and respond to those questions. It might be that we have a focus in our virtual briefing for leaders and governors in January. We might do a particular piece of framework or documentation that responds to questions. It may be that we put on some additional training. So depending on what comes up in those questions that you raise, we will make sure we respond to them, but it won't be this evening. So if you could use those, the chat box for those, that would be brilliant. And as I've mentioned, if you could stay on mute, that will make it easier for everybody. Right, I think that is everything I needed to say at the beginning. So we will get started. This is going to be a bit of a tag team between myself and Richard, so you don't listen to one voice for too long. So we will be swapping between us as we go through the session. Okay, so as you know, we have a new SIAMS framework that is going to be coming in September 2023. So what we're going to be exploring in the hour we've got this afternoon is why now and why this. So we'll find out a bit about the rationale behind the new framework. We're going to unpick what it will look like, what it's going to mean for you in schools and in trusts, and then when will changes take place. So why now and why this?
Okay, thank you.
Oh. Thanks. Sorry, go on, Rich. I was going to say over to you.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. Hello, everybody. It's great to see a lot of friends out there, and one or two people I don't yet know. As Carrie said, we're sharing this between us. We've got a lot of slides to get through, so we'll be moving quite quickly. And Carrie's in charge of the actual slides, so I will keep asking Carrie to move on to the next slide. Forgive me for doing that. So these are the things in this next section that we're going to be looking at. So next slide, please, Carrie. Just bear in mind that the message that we're giving you today is very much the message we've been asked to give you by the SIAMS national team. So we might not we might not be quite as natural as we normally are, because we're having to make sure we look at notes and tell you what we've been told to tell you. So again, forgive us there. But yeah, we've got this schedule. Or the old schedule was written in a different context. This is something we've been asked to really point out. So for example, obviously the impact of the suspension of inspection between March 2020 and September 2021 has really changed a lot of stuff. SIAM said that they had a lot of feedback from school leaders saying that they found the grade boundaries for SIAMS to be a bit arbitrary, certainly very broad. I mean, that good judgment really did cover a very, very wide spectrum. Indeed, also the excellent grade was very problematic, and the SIAMS team is telling us that there was often disagreements between school leaders and SIAMS inspectors about what exactly the definition of excellent was, and that they were finding that a little bit unhelpful. Also, SIAMS was always very keen to try not to be a box-ticking exercise, but the message they're giving is that anything that you call a schedule, and they call the thing that we're using at the moment, they call a schedule, to be replaced by the new thing, which will be a framework. But they said the schedule still felt too box ticky for them, and they wanted to get away from box ticking so that we can focus instead on outcomes. So next slide, please, Carrie. So this is no, the one that says the minimal tweaks made for autumn. Yeah, that's the one. Thank you. So again, if you remember, in the summer term of 2021, there's some changes to the framework. They changed quite a lot of stuff related to the excellent judgment, also tweaked some other stuff. But they're now saying that just wasn't enough. And in order to get to where they want to be in this new world, they want to do a more radical change. But at that time, the changes were quite minimal. Next slide, please, Carrie. Thank you. So this is the kind of overall message that SIAMS want to get across. And it's these three things about being relational, interpretative, I said that correctly, and subjective as well. So they want to first of all emphasize that to get away from box ticking, they want to make it about a relationship. Now, I know it's difficult to have a relationship with somebody that you see once for a day and then never see again. But nevertheless, when the process is happening to you, and bear in mind that it happens to you actually over the week before the inspection as well as on the inspection day, that they want to build a relationship between the school and the inspector. They want to give scope for interpretation. Actually, could I ask that people keep their microphones on mute, please? They want to leave scope for interpretation as part of this thing about get away from box ticking and give the school and the inspector the opportunity to interpret both the evidence that they're looking at and the framework in which they're operating. And then the third thing, and it's not something that you hear every day, that they actually want to emphasize, sorry, the next slide, please, Carrie. They want to emphasize as well the subjective nature of what we're doing here, which is very interesting because often people are at odds to really try and emphasize how very, very objective it is. But this is kind of unashamedly subjective, even though it's very, very evidence-based. But what they want to be able to do is, with the evidence available, to be able to interpret it in different ways, in different contexts. Okay, so they're the three words: rational, interpretive, and subjective. So next slide, please, Carrie. A reminder, therefore, of what these words mean. So quantitative is about stuff that you can measure, and particularly that in our world, that is assessment outcomes. But qualitative, on the other hand, is talking about characteristics or descriptors, anything that cannot be measured but can be observed both by the school and observed by the inspector, and then can be interpreted subjectively. So actually, it seems to me, speaking as someone kind of who's been on both ends of this SIAMS thing, that's a jolly good thing, because it gives the inspector the freedom to interpret things, and that's not to try and be too harsh on the school, but rather to be able to interpret things generously as well. And it gives the school the opportunity to argue their interpretation of events. So I personally quite like moving in that direction. Qualitative data can then be classified to create judgments, and then as it says here, to come up with mutually exclusive categories. So next slide, please, Karen. Okay, so this is a really key piece of information, that the new SIAMS framework, starting in September 23, will express the inspection outcome as a qualitative judgment and not as a grade. So grades are going and they're being replaced by judgments, and we'll come on in a few minutes to exactly what they look like. But now it's back over to Carrie.
Thank you, Richard. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time exploring what the 2023 framework will look like. So there are some bullet points here that just explore that for you a little bit. Some of the key messages coming through from the national team are that schools should not be establishing a Christian vision for education just because they're having a SIAMS inspection. It needs to go much deeper than that and be part of your everyday work. And that Christian vision should emerge partly from a combination of what the Bible, Christian tradition, and the teaching of the church teaches us, which is theology about education. really good example of a theologically rooted Christian vision is the Church of England's vision for education, deeply Christian, serving the common good. So if you want to see an example of that in action, that's a good place to go. But that vision should be representing the Christian foundation of your school. It should have clarity and understanding by the leaders in the school, and it should represent the needs of your community. But Richard is going to go into a bit more detail about that theologically rooted vision a bit later on some other slides. So from September 23, there's a greater emphasis really from the SIAMS inspectors around that Christian vision. There's high expectations that it's going to be a genuine Christian vision that's rooted in theology as a basic expectation. And the team nationally are quite keen to stress that adding a Bible verse, sorry if that person could mute, thank you, that adding a Bible verse onto the end of a vision that's got no theological roots is not going to be enough, and the judgments will highlight it if that is the case. There's a bullet point on here about schools context, which remains highly significant in the conversation that you're going to be having with the inspectors. You're really going to be empowered to explain what you're doing and why you do it in relation to the community that you're serving. And then there's a greater emphasis on trust leaders. So if you are part of a multi-academy trust, there's quite a significant increase in emphasis on how trust leaders are going to be held to account for their work with church schools. So the actual framework itself has 6 inspection questions, and we will be unpicking those this afternoon. We'll be going through them on later slides. And those inspection questions are high-level questions, and the school will be able to provide evidence how their Christian vision-driven work is having the intended effect. There is a 7th question for any VA or former VA schools linked in specifically to teaching and learning in RE. There is no longer any criteria, as we've got in the current schedule, which you can sort of refer to and use. It's not about meeting criteria, it's about focusing on impact and being able to evidence that impact, with the Christian vision and your specific context being the driving factors. There are 2 parts of the process. So there's going to be the gathering of the evidence when an inspector is in school, and that is very much going to be a collaborative process between yourselves and the inspector that you're working with. The second part is the inspector using that evidence base to reach their judgments. And that second part will not be collaborative. That will be the inspector doing that on their own. So the collaborative thing is all around that discussion that you'll be having whilst they're in school. So Richard has already mentioned this, but one of the significant changes with the new framework is that inspectors will be making judgments instead of awarding grades as we're used to currently. So we're going to spend a few slides now exploring what is the same and what is different within this new framework. Most of SIAMS 23 is going to be the same for schools as it is currently. It's really important to stress that there are no new concepts or content, even though this emphasis on that theologically rooted Christian vision is sharper than it has been before. The biggest difference with this framework is actually going to be for inspectors, because the way that they're going to be approaching inspection is going to be much more discursive, and they're going to have a tighter focus on a school's context and the community that they're serving. That means that the questioning is going to be more open, and it's going to focus, as I've said before, on impact rather than you meeting a list of criteria. So essentially, it's around whether the Christian vision is having the intended positive effect in enabling pupils and adults to flourish. If so, how is it doing that? And if it's not, why isn't it doing that? So the biggest change that you probably will have recognised is this moving from grades to judgments. The national team really want to emphasise that this is not a dumbing down of the process, but it just ensures that there is coherence between the type of evidence that's being gathered and the way it's being used to express an outcome. And we've got more detail on judgments in later slides as well. So the content, as we've said, remains virtually the same. The work on Christian vision, although we've got that greater emphasis, we've had Christian vision as part of the schedule since 2018. So that's not different. It's just the way, the depth it's going to be explored with leaders. They've emphasised there that it's not reimagining what it means to be a church school. The great work that you are doing on the ground every day carries on in exactly the same way. One of the sort of catchy slogans that the national team have been using is radically different, radically the same. And they've just explored on this slide exactly what they mean. And you can see from the radically the same list that all of those things that you're already doing will carry on being exactly the same and being valued in the same way as they are now. So the biggest difference is for the inspectors. It stays the same for schools. It's worth mentioning here that this new documentation is called a framework. So from September 23, we're using the language of framework rather than schedule, which is what we're using at the moment. And that is because a schedule encourages a tick box approach to a set of criteria, whereas the framework doesn't. So that's why they've just amended the vocabulary that they're using. So a bit of a slide exploring what inspectors are going to be doing. We will be coming back to that theologically rooted Christian vision, but obviously there is that expectation that that will be there within schools, and the judgments and the reports will be reflecting that vision. A set of Christian values is not the same as having a Christian vision. So the vision can be lived out, it can be worked out through the Christian values, but inspectors will not accept values in place of a vision. It has to be vision first, can be delivered through values, but you can't have values and no vision. That's not going to be accepted by inspectors. There are national expectations as well, this is particularly for trust schools, between the DfE and the National Society about acceptable governance structures for trusts. And inspectors will be expecting to see those in practice and will be reporting on how they impact on the church school. So again, that greater scrutiny around trust governance. There will be the inspection conversations, that greater dialogue I've already mentioned, and that is to encourage and empower you to be able to talk openly and freely about your school. Those conversations are still going to be directed and shaped by lines of inquiry. You'll still get lines of inquiry before the inspection day, but it's going to be a lot more discursive than they currently are in inspections at the moment. Again, emphasising that focus on impact, and it's up to you as a school how you achieve that impact. And then there's this expectation around a meaningful relationship with the Diocesan Board of Education. So they will be looking, inspectors will be looking at how schools and trusts engage meaningfully with the things that are on offer from the local diocese. So the inspection structure is broadly in 3 sections. We have 2 sections unpicking the context of the school, and I'm going to talk about these in a bit more detail shortly. So we've got context of the school 1, which is who are we? Context of the school 2, what are we doing here? And then we have the actual inspection questions, which is around how then shall we live and learn together. So here are the questions that come up under context of the school 1, who we are. And this context will be established in the pre-inspection paperwork and on the initial call that happens between the inspector and the head teacher. No judgments will be made on any of these items here. This really is just to ensure understanding, to make sure your inspector fully understands the context that you're operating in. And this will all be information that as head teachers, you will know, you'll be very familiar with it. These are continuation of those questions, so I'll give you just a minute to have a look at those. And then context of the school 2, what are we doing here? This will be the first time that the head teacher and the inspector get to explore the theological rootedness of the school's Christian vision. And this information will be likely covered in your summary SEF that you submit, but also there will be discussion during your pre-inspection call. And it's about the inspector really starting to understand the vision and how it's theologically rooted and why you as a school in particular have chosen that vision and are working with it. And of course, that conversation will continue on into the inspection day as well. There's no preference at all from SIAMS as to whether a school should be an academy or a maintained school, but governors are going to be expected to be able to explain to the inspector why they've made the decision that they have, whether they are maintained or whether they're in a trust, and what the positive impact is for the pupils. Final 2 points there, I think, are quite self-explanatory. Just to say that there will be a conversation that's going to address how governors monitor impact, both governors and directors, actually, how they monitor impact in the school. This is a continuation of that context of the school too, so some more bullet points. Again, that emphasis is all around the inspector being able to understand the school's work and context. It's giving the head teacher the opportunity to explain the what and why, and then the inspector triangulates that on the inspection day when they're in the school. There'll be some questions within here around collective worship, whether you've got pupils who are withdrawn, how many, what are you doing with them? There'll be questions around RE, how you organise it, leadership of it, staff training, CPD, and then again questions around how you engage with the diocese and also with the church. Richard, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. So we've said that the whole thing is based on a kind of relationship and conversations and the answers that you give to these key questions. So the questions themselves are not a tick list, but rather they are things where you prepare what your answer is going to be, which will be different for different schools in different contexts. So next slide, please, Carrie. Question 1. So as each of these comes up, you can see what the question is, so I don't need to read it to you, but you can see that this question focuses on how your school's Christian vision is lived out in practice. It will build on the pre-inspection conversation that you will have already had with the inspector exactly 1 week before the day of the inspection. And it either presupposes that it's already there, or it acknowledges that it will be an issue for development if it's part of what's called a J2 judgment, which we'll come on to later. There's no expectation that a school community should be able to recite a vision. So it's not just about being able to recite some words, but rather it's about them being able to talk, both adults and children, about what their experience of it is, what difference it makes to their lives, and how it is that they feel that the leaders of the school have actually brought this about. There should very much be coherence and cohesion between the Christian vision and then how it's lived out in Christian values. So that's something that schools really need to think about, because a lot of schools have been using values for a long time, and that doesn't mean that's a bad thing. It doesn't mean you've got to stop doing it, but just as was the case before anyway, if you're using values to support your vision, it's got to be really, really obvious why those values are right for your context and why they do support the vision. There are no specific strategies that are required or expected, but just so long as the vision is actually making a difference to pupils and enabling them to flourish. Because remember that overall question about how the Christian vision helps adults and pupils to flourish, that has not changed. Flourishing is still what it's all about. The context of the school was always really, really important. But I think maybe SIAMS got a little bit frustrated by the fact that even though they emphasise the importance of context, a lot of stuff the schools were coming up with felt generic. So therefore, there's going to be an even greater emphasis on making sure that you've got a vision that is right for your context. Also, this issue of monitoring by governors, it's not explicitly mentioned in the framework because the framework isn't a list of boxes you've got to tick, but nevertheless it will be an expectation that somehow or other governors will have some kind of a systemic way of knowing what the impact of the school vision is on the flourishing of the people in the school. And each of these IQ questions, as we go through them, is asking what the impact is of being part of a trust. Okay, so obviously that's only relevant to you if your school is an academy, but nevertheless, the inspector will be looking for evidence of how being part of that trust actually makes your school a better school and enables the Christian vision to be lived out in your school. So next slide, please, Carrie. So this is IQ 2. If the school's vision is reflected in the life of the school at all, then it should be reflected really obviously in the curriculum, because schools, obviously, we're not churches, we're schools, we're there to learn. And it's the whole curriculum, not just the RE curriculum. That's only part of the curriculum. But SIAMS is not Ofsted, and therefore it's asking questions and making judgments about the curriculum that are very, very different from Ofsted, although SIAMS inspectors will take note of Ofsted findings if they came within 12 months of the SIAMS inspection. Okay, SIAMS will not be interested in scrutinizing any kind of performance data, just the same as Ofsted in that respect. Well, or internal data, but even external data as well. But rather, inspectors will ask leaders how they know that the curriculum is having the intended effect that they want to have on the pupils. Okay, there cannot be a definition of flourishing, therefore, that excludes academic flourishing. All right, so therefore, yeah, we want flourishing, but don't go for a definition of flourishing that is purely dispositional, because children have got to be obviously learning more in school. One size does not fit all, but that should definitely not be an excuse for low standards. I mean, I hope none of our schools would ever do that. It seems so old-fashioned now, the idea that, oh, you know, we're just interested in character development, we're not interested in children's academic development. I hope that none of us would say that anyway. The taught curriculum really should be an expression of the vision. For example, if the vision is giving aspiration to the community, or if the vision is about aspiration, then what's aspirational about your curriculum? And it's important that leaders can talk really specifically and give specific examples of how the curriculum supports the vision. Spiritual development is a really important concept, both under the old schedule and under the new framework, but it's important that it's not seen as a sort of separate add-on. But again, you've got to be able to show how the curriculum helps pupils in your school to develop spiritually. That means you've got to know what you mean by developing spiritually. You've got to know what you're actually looking for. And also, it's really, really important is that the curriculum, well, I mean, we know from Ofsted the curriculum should be ambitious for all pupils, including SEND and disadvantaged pupils. But what SIAMS are looking for is how does your curriculum enable SEND, disadvantaged, and any other group of pupils actually to flourish. Next slide, please, Carrie. There's IQ 3. So again, it's a similar thing. Does collective worship enable the school to flourish spiritually, both adults and children? If not, why not? If it does, how does it do this? Okay. There is an expectation that the school's vision, the school's foundation, which for all of us is a Church of England foundation, and the relationship that you have with your local church and with us in the diocese should very much shape the worship life of the school and should inform the school's spiritual life. Okay, so you need to be able to talk about and explain that, and explain why it's right in your context, why you're doing worship the way that you're doing it in your context to deliver your vision, enable your adults and pupils to flourish. SIAMS has a document called the Collective Worship Statement of Entitlement. This is still a very important document. Your diocesan advisor should be talking to you about that, and you should be looking at that, because in that you've got 3 I's, which have nothing to do with the Ofsted 3 I's. It's about your worship being invitational and inspirational as well, and therefore you need to be conscious of that. You need to really be clear about what is the definition of spirituality and spiritual development in your school. I've mentioned that before, but it's so important. If worship is supposed to be a part of bringing about spiritual development, then what is it about your worship that brings about the kind of spiritual development that you want to have? Also, when you have visitors in, maybe from the local church, leading worship, it's really important that you can tell them what you want the impact of your worship to be. You want the impact to be that children develop spiritually, but you've got to be able to tell them what that actually looks like in your school so that they can make the worship have that impact. But there are no one-size-fits-all specific approaches. I mean, I think this is great. You know, you do it your way that works for your vision and for your school, but also if you're an academy, the inspector will want to know how the trust is supporting you in that as well. Next slide, please, Carrie. So here we're looking at the culture in which adults and pupils are treated well. So the inspector will want to be finding out about what is it like to actually be a child, or indeed to be an employee or a volunteer inside this school community. I mean, it's an absolute basic minimum that people should expect to be treated well in a school, but what kind of policies and practices and procedures does the school have in place to go beyond that and to address the well-being of people in schools, okay, which is incredibly important in our church schools, because church theology is that we are all made in the image of God, and that therefore we should be treating each other as sacred people. It will look different in different contexts. Everything looks different in different contexts with different visions. Inspectors will want to be able to see how your approach to well-being has a tangible impact on the school and grows out of the vision, and that it's rooted in the vision. I'm sure you know this anyway, but mental health and well-being are not the same thing. They're both very, very important, but they're not the same thing, and therefore inspectors will want to see how you're approaching both. They'll want to know how you know that what you're doing about well-being and mental health is having the outcome that you want. And it's interesting, you got this reference there, if you notice it, to difficult times under D, where it says including those deemed to be vulnerable at difficult times, okay? But this refers to any difficult times, because again, it's about the context in your school, and there might be difficult times nationally, whether it's COVID or economics, but there could be very specific things in your school that are difficult, maybe a bereavement, and it's important to be able to talk about how your school vision has supported you through those difficult times. Next slide, please, Carrie. Moving on to IQ 5, justice and responsibility. This again is based on positive relationships, children and adults understanding they've got a responsibility for the world and other people, that they understand the balance between rights and responsibilities, but importantly that this grows out of the Christian vision, that it's obvious from your Christian vision how you're coming at this. This concept of courageous advocacy is still incredibly important, as it was, or rather is, under the existing schedule. I'm hoping that you're getting used to this idea and that you've got a good feel for what it means. Your diocesan advisors will talk to you about that regularly, and you can ask them about that. There is a document, again, a church document, which your diocesan advisor can give you. They should already have given it to you at some point in the last year or two as well, but they can give you it again if you need it, which drills into more detail about what courageous advocacy actually means. But it's about going beyond fundraising. The way SIAMS often characterize it is beyond the bake sale. It's about actually helping children in an age-appropriate way to understand what are the issues of justice that underlie injustices that they come across. And again, this has all got to be related to the school's vision. Next slide, please, Carrie. Looking at religious education now. So religious education is looked at by the inspector in all schools, whether they're VC or VA, even though there's an extra thing for VA, which we'll come on to in a moment. It's interesting, we've got three three P's here, three new P's about the provision, the profile, and the priority of religious education. Again, you've got a document here to help you, the religious education statement of entitlement. All your RE leads should be familiar with that. The school leaders and governors should be familiar with it as well, and should be able to talk about how you deliver that, but also how you deliver it in a way which is consistent with your underlying vision. It's not just about other Christianity and other faiths, but it's about theology, philosophy, and human science as well. Obviously, if you're a VC school, you've got to teach the local authority-approved syllabus for whichever authority that you're in there. So obviously, SIAMS are not going to make a judgment about the syllabus, because you have to teach that, but they are going to be looking at how you shape that syllabus into a curriculum that reflects your underlying vision. Okay, in a VA school, it's got, as you know, I'm sure it's the governing body who are responsible for the syllabus. So in a VA school, the question would be very much, well, why have you chosen this particular syllabus, and why, again, does it reflect and support your underlying Christian vision? Often this is where people talk about resources. Oh, we've given RE a lot of resources. Oh, we've done loads of CPD on RE. That's brilliant, well done. It's good to do that, but as you would expect, the question just isn't what did you do, but rather why did you do it and what was the impact. Next slide, please. Carrie, this is IQ7 is just for voluntary aided schools, former voluntary aided academies, and then a very small category, which is former voluntary controlled schools, which now teach denominational education, which I think we just got 1 or 2 in the dice. And here you get this extra question, and it's about related to the quality of teaching, about outcomes and assessment in RE, and that's to do with the law under Section 48 of the 2005 Act, that SIAMS it does actually have to make a judgment about whether RE is being well taught and is having the right impact in your school. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, Carrie, move on to this subject of judgment. So yeah, leaders and inspectors working together to create a comprehensive evidence base. But when it comes to making the judgment, they're not working together on the judgment. So the inspector's working with you to get the evidence, but he or she themselves will be the person who makes the judgment. Okay, but it's your job as school leaders to make sure that they've got all the best possible information to inform them in that judgment. So next slide, please, Carrie. So you've got there are now just 2 judgments that you'll get one or the other. Judgment 1 is exactly as it says there. You will be given that judgment if it is the case that inspectors, having looked for evidence of an effective and theologically rooted Christian vision, are able to say that they came across one. We'll come on to what theologically rooted means in a few minutes. To get judgment 1, or J1 as we now started to call it, it's important that there's enough evidence for all 6, or if you're a VA school, all 7 of the questions, to say that the impact of those is enabling pupils and adults to flourish in the school. There needs to be evidence for all of the questions, okay, and also it is helpful for leaders to look at what we'll look at in a minute, which is a J2, in order to check that they feel that that there is nothing there that might be true of their school. So on that one, Carrie, if we could go over onto the next slide, J2, and this is the judgment 2, which is that the vision and practice in the school are not enabling it and fully to live up to its foundation as a church school, okay? And then it goes on to list the reasons. So this happens not necessarily because something's dreadful, but because the inspector could not find evidence to say that pupils were flourishing in this area. So that's why it's really important that you and your fellow leaders are able to provide them with evidence. They will say which areas it is. We'll come on to that in a second. What SIAMS are really keen to emphasise is that a J2 judgment is not a failed SIAMS inspection. So this is not pass or fail. This is just saying either there are no areas where pupils are not flourishing, or it's saying there are one or more areas where they are not flourishing, and therefore the school needs to do more. But SIAMS really, really keen to emphasise it's not a pass or a fail. Okay. Although we have been asked to stress that if an inspector highlights the majority or even all of the questions under J2 as being areas where they couldn't find evidence of pupils and adults flourishing, then that really would be, it would be true that that school is falling a long way short of being effective as a church school. So if we could go on to the next slide, please, Carrie. Thank you. So these are self-explanatory, but they go through the questions and just say that the school leaders and if you're academy trust leaders have not ensured that each of these things happens, and therefore that flourishing is brought about. So if we go on to the next slide, please, and that just goes through the similar thing for the rest of the questions. So J1 is if none of these things is true. J2 is if one or more of these things is true. Then if we could go to the next slide, please, Carrie, and that says, as you can see, that the judgment number 2 will highlight the areas where the school needs to focus, as well as indicate the school's strengths, and it could be any combination of the above, any permutation, any number of those from 1 to 7. Okay, back to you, Carrie.
Thank you, Richard. We're just going to spend a few slides now exploring what it means for you. So that's what it means for schools, but also what it is going to mean for trusts. So some of this is a reminder of what we've heard across previous slides, that there are no new concepts or criteria for schools to tackle, that it's a new way of inspecting that's making judgments instead of awarding grades, that there's going to be a more rigorous expectation of that theologically rooted Christian vision. But this has been expected since 2018, so it's not a new development. Emphasising that the main differences are going to be a freer inspection practice where inspectors can focus on outcomes and how you've achieved that, and that school leaders are going to be strongly encouraged to explain how they're achieving them as a result of that Christian vision. So the consequences of an inspector not having enough evidence to answer the IQs positively are listed here. So that's going to be intervention and support from your school advisor and the diocesan team. And then it will be earlier re-inspection. So it'll be re-inspection after 3 years. That will kick in once they've caught up the post-COVID backlog. Whilst they're still in the process of catching up on that post-COVID backlog, it won't be 3 years. But the list continues to be published. So each summer term, really keep an eye on that national website because the list will be published for the coming academic year. This is just a little bit about trusts, and you'll have seen as we've gone through that those responsibilities of the trust are being brought to the fore. But it's important to stress that the inspection remains an inspection of the individual school. But for each academy, the trust has responsibilities for which it will be held to account. Richard, back to you.
Okay, thank you. So I mentioned earlier this really important concept of the theologically rooted Christian vision. Now, this has grown out of something, in a sense, it's not new, because it existed in the existing framework where it's called a theological underpinning to the Christian vision, and it was always there as an expectation. But I think SIAMS were a bit frustrated that schools were not making as much progress as they wanted on this one. So even though it's not a new thing, it really is something that is being very significantly emphasised. Okay, so inspectors will no longer simply accept what a school offers as a Christian vision, but they will actually interrogate school leaders in order to establish its theological rootedness. So the question is not just, there's your Christian vision, okay, tell me about why it's right for this context, but the question is also, now explain to me the Christian underlying theology as to why this is right for your school. It's important for leaders to be on top of that and to be able to explain that. Theological rootedness is not the same as biblical rootedness. So of course, the Bible contains the vast majority of the theology of the Church of England, but theological does not equal just biblical, because theology is a combination of scripture and the teachings and traditions of the Church of England as well. And school leaders may wish to explore the overlap between their own vocation, the context of the school, and the theological rootedness of the school. Something that's looked at in the next slide. Carrie, thank you. Which just, there's quite a lot to look at there, but it gives you a kind of a feel for what SIAMS are getting at. So the background or context to the inspection is created by, well, a combination of both the legal background, the various education acts, it's about SIAMS and Ofsted, but also very importantly, it's about the school's trust deed itself, the fact that the school has a Church of England foundation. All our schools have this foundation. That's why all our schools have got foundation governors if they haven't become academies. This was all there in the existing framework, but it's just getting a greater emphasis in this framework. You're being encouraged as leaders to reflect upon your vocation. Who are you as a leader? Why are you motivated to do the job that you do? Context, you should have thought about that already anyway, and you should be able to explain everything that happens in your school in terms of its context. But I know when we do vision training at the diocese, we always really encourage you to drill into the context of your school. But then also you've got this theology area where school leaders may want to go back to the sources of scripture and the teachings and traditions of the church to be able to explain their vision and why they run their schools in the way they do. And others may accept the Church of England vision for education as something that's already done the job for them. Again, in our vision training, we always strongly recommend that you go and look at that document. It's called Deeply Christian, Serving the Common Good, published in 2016, which is an excellent document and also is an excellent example of a vision which is theologically rooted. So if you want to know what a theologically rooted vision looks like, then look at the Church of England national vision. Okay. A Bible verse may very well help to illustrate the theological roots of the vision, but it's not essential and it's not theological root. So there's no rule that says your vision has to have a Bible verse attached to it, although many of them do. But your Bible verse is not your theological roots. So if someone says to you, what are the theological roots of your vision? You can't just quote the Bible verse that's on the display on the wall, because it should go so much deeper than that. So if you can have the next slide, please, Carrie. And again, this speaks for itself. And again, it's weird. Why this vision? Where does it come from? They talk about it as the provenance of the vision, and it's really important that leaders and governors can explain that. Again, report on vision as theologically rooted and not just something that could be a secular vision with a Bible verse attached to it. It's recommended that school leaders do diocesan training to understand improvement of that. We're working on providing that for you for the rest of this academic year. I think Carrie's just going to mention something at the end, and it's a really good idea to get church leaders involved in that. Now, I know the leadership structures vary from parish to parish, and in some parishes, a church, a vicar or an incumbent is spread across very many parishes and finds it hard to have the capacity for this. We understand that, but you can talk to your diocesan advisor about that, because when it says the church, it's not just the local church. And again, it's something that we as a diocese are going to be helping you with our CPD, both for the rest of this year and probably into the indefinite future. So if we could have the next slide, please, Carrie. I've mentioned this before, it's popped up before, but this is not about getting children to kind of learn something and recite something. It's about children being able to explain something. I mean, yeah, it's great if it's memorable and they can make reference to it when they're talking about it, but they need to be able to say so much more about it. They need to be able to say how it actually impacts on their life in school, and that's not something that you can teach anybody to recite, because as you can see, they're looking for evidence, although bear in mind that discursive evidence is fine, so don't think that you've got to have loads of videos or evidence folders or anything like that. You know, what people say is taken as evidence, and then also to see evidence before their eyes of pupils and adults actually flourishing because of the vision. It's really important. I know we all know this anyway, but it's really important to focus on impact and outcomes rather than process. I mean, you know, it's the old Ofsted "so what" question. You know, you can say you've done this, that, and the other, but so what? What has the impact of it actually been? How has it transformed anybody's life? So next slide, please, Carrie. These are things that an inspector will not be convinced by as a substitute for a proper theologically rooted Christian vision. Okay, a list of Christian values. Now, I know that in the olden days, Christian values is what it was all about, and some schools have got such well-established Christian values that they kind of kept using them. That's fine, as long as those values are really clearly linked to the vision. As long as you've got a vision as well, and it's obvious why those values arise from the vision. But to say, oh, we don't have a vision because we've got values instead, or our values are our vision, is not going to achieve what you need to achieve here. Similarly, a vision that just has a Bible verse added on with no particular theological understanding is not going to be what's needed here. And just some sort of generic phrasing. So you might have a vision which is a secular vision, and then you stick on the front of the "in our Christian school," which actually is a phrase we shouldn't be using in our schools, but in our church school or in our loving community or whatever. You stick that on the beginning of something that isn't a theologically rooted Christian vision. It doesn't magically make it a theologically rooted Christian vision. So they are some quite useful indicators there. Back over to you, Carrie.
Thank you, Richard. We're just coming to the final few slides now, so we will finish on time, hopefully. So just thinking about when will the changes take place. So you will be in a period of transition now, right through until the end of this academic year. And we will be providing some training during that time. The first training that we do want to flag up to you is going to be a face-to-face session on Friday, the 13th of January in the afternoon, times to be confirmed. But that's going to take place in Chelmsford. And the focus of that session is going to be how to uncover the theological roots of your Christian vision. So if you've been sitting there thinking, oh, we need to do a bit more work on that, or we need to think that through a bit more and go into a bit more depth, then do get yourself on that course. We'll be advertising it shortly, and that will be run and led by Richard. We also continue to have our SIAMS workshops. The SIAMS workshop in spring will continue to focus on the current schedule. So for those schools that are on the list this year, they're encouraged to come along to the SIAMS workshop in spring. The SIAMS workshop in the summer term will start the work focusing on this new framework. So if you're expecting to be in the window, then do sign up for our SIAMS workshop in the summer, where we'll be unpicking this in greater detail. Just a reminder that all our courses are free, so there's no additional cost to attend any of those. So final 2 slides. This really just establishes the baseline for the new framework that's setting a high bar for the quality of church school education. So really it's just about encouraging you to keep doing all the brilliant things you're doing, being as effective as you already are, and living up to that foundation of the church school and living out those Christian visions that you've already got in place. Something the national team want to do is to be able to start celebrating the work of schools from dioceses across the country on the national stage, and they're looking at how to develop that. So on this final slide, again, they acknowledge that there'll be training within the diocese, and we also get regular updates from the national team, so we hear the latest information that is coming out. The plan is for them to further develop their website, and that is where not only will they continue to publish the annual report that we had for the first time in the summer, but they're also going to be sharing case studies around things like worship and vision and courageous advocacy, so that there's a centre really there of best practice, so that schools dip into that and use that as well. So that brings us to the end of the session this evening. We've pretty much finished on time, which is brilliant because there was a lot for us to race through. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. The session has been recorded, so it will be available afterwards, along with the slides. They will actually go out on Reflect and Connect and the upcoming Reflect and Connect this week. So head teachers, do look out for those. Any further questions, your school advisor is fully up to date with all of this information, so do refer to them. They can support you as well through the process. But thank you very much for being here, and we will see you all soon.